Hey guys, welcome aboard to Just Sleep Stories. Tonight we're drifting gently into the ancient world's version of real estate listings that would absolutely not pass inspection today. Specifically, we're touring the worst neighbourhoods in ancient Rome and a few other historical places where the phrase charming fixer-upper mostly meant the building might collapse on you before breakfast. Now when people think of ancient Rome, they imagine marble columns, majestic emperors, dramatic speeches, and maybe a toga party that got wildly out of hand. But what they don't imagine is the smell, or the rats, or the guy upstairs emptying a chamber pot out the window with the confidence of someone who believes gravity is other people's problem. Because while Rome did have palaces and grand villas, most people lived in apartment blocks called insulae. And by apartment blocks, I mean tall stacks of bricks and wood held together by optimism, loose regulations, and a landlord who absolutely promised the stairs were safe last week. So tonight, we're wandering through the narrow alleys, overcrowded tenements, and occasionally flaming neighbourhoods of the ancient world. Places where your downstairs neighbour might be a baker, your upstairs neighbour might be a goat, and your landlord is probably bribing the fire brigade not to notice the building leaning like a tired gladiator. Before we step into these historical slums, though, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy drifting through history with me like this. And if this topic was suggested by one of you brilliant night owls in the comments, thank you. I love seeing what strange corners of the past you want to explore while the rest of the world is asleep. You can also leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is. Somehow it's always either midnight, or 3 in the morning, or that weird hour where your brain decides to remember embarrassing things you said in 2009. Now dim the lights a little, maybe turn on a fan so there's a soft hum in the background, get comfortable, adjust your pillow, and if your feet are sticking out of the blanket, you might want to tuck them in. Because tonight we're entering neighbourhoods where even the cats look slightly criminal. And let's think about this for a moment. Have you ever complained about thin apartment walls? Imagine living somewhere where the walls are so thin you can hear your neighbour arguing about olives 3 floors away. Have you ever worried about your rent going up? Try paying rent for a room so small that if you stretch your arms, you accidentally redecorate both walls. What about noise complaints? Could you sleep while carts rattle past all night, dogs bark, merchants shout, and someone nearby is hammering metal like they're forging Thor's spare hammer at 3 in the morning? And what about plumbing? Do you enjoy the miracle of indoor plumbing, where the water goes away from you? Because in some Roman neighbourhoods, the plumbing system was basically gravity, a gutter, and a prayer. Would you survive a week living above a bakery that runs all night, next to a tavern that runs all night, across from a brothel that also runs all night? Would you trust a 5-story wooden apartment building in a city famous for fires? Would you walk down an alley where the main street lighting is, a torch held by a guy who may or may not be drunk? Well, congratulations. You've just woken up in ancient Rome. This century is somewhere in the early Roman Empire. You're standing in a narrow street that smells faintly of bread, smoke, sewage, and mystery stew. And somewhere nearby, a landlord is explaining that the building definitely won't collapse this week. Probably. Welcome to the neighbourhood. You wake up inside what the Romans proudly call an insula, which translates roughly to apartment building, but feels more like a stack of rooms balancing on a nervous pile of bricks. These buildings rise 4, 5, sometimes even 6 stories above the street, which sounds impressive until you realise Roman building codes were mostly a suggestion whispered politely to wealthy landlords. The lower floors, where the rich tenants live, are sturdy stone and brick. The upper floors where you live are wood, cheap plaster, and the faint smell of someone cooking onions 3 doors away. Your room is about the size of a generous closet, but the rent is still somehow high because, congratulations, you live in the heart of Rome. From your window you can see laundry lines, stray cats, and a baker yelling at someone who owes him 2 loaves, and a very convincing apology. Now the first thing you notice is the stairs, because if you live on the upper floors, and you absolutely do, the stairs are now the central challenge of your life. They are steep, narrow, and worn smooth by thousands of sandals. Walking down them requires a delicate balance between confidence and prayer. Walking up them requires the lung capacity of a marathon runner and the determination of someone chasing the last slice of pizza. Every morning you descend these stairs carefully, trying not to trip over the bucket someone left halfway down. It is unclear whose bucket this is. No one claims it. It simply exists, like a philosophical question about gravity. The lower levels of the insula are actually quite respectable. Wealthier tenants rent these apartments because they are closer to the street, easier to access, and far less likely to collapse dramatically during dinner. They even have windows that look out onto the street rather than a brick wall, or the mysterious darkness of the neighbouring building. But up here on the upper levels, life becomes more adventurous. The rooms are smaller, the walls thinner, and the building itself seems to sway slightly when a heavy cart rolls past outside. This is not an earthquake. This is simply your building reminding you that it was constructed quickly, cheaply, and with the structural enthusiasm of a stack of bread loaves. And then there is the heat. In summer, the upper floors trap the warmth of the Roman sun like a clay oven. The air becomes thick and still, turning your room into something that feels suspiciously like a sauna, but without the relaxing part. You open your window for air, which allows a refreshing breeze, along with dust, noise, and occasionally a very curious pigeon. In winter, however, the same room transforms into an icebox. The thin walls provide roughly the same insulation as a philosophical debate about warmth. Now let's talk about safety. Roman writers frequently complained about insulae collapsing. Entire buildings sometimes crumbled because they were built quickly by landlords eager to maximize rent. Imagine renting an apartment where the review section reads, "Great location, lively neighborhood, slight chance of sudden gravity-related structural event." Emperor Augustus even passed regulations limiting how tall these buildings could be. This was Rome's version of saying, maybe we should stop stacking apartments like unstable lasagna. Of course, regulations are one thing, enforcement is another. So every night you climb the creaking staircase back to your room, step over someone's laundry basket, duck under a beam that looks slightly too cracked, and lie down on your straw mattress. The building groans quietly around you, like an old ship settling in the harbour, and as you drift towards sleep you comfort yourself with a reassuring thought. If the building collapses tonight, at least the rent will probably go down. Let's talk about your landlord, a man who owns several of these insulae and has the warm personality of a tax collector at a birthday party. Roman landlords were known for packing as many tenants as possible into their buildings, because every extra room meant extra rent. Maintenance, however, was more of a philosophical concept. Cracks in the wall are described as ventilation. A leaning staircase is described as character. If a beam creaks loudly every night, the landlord assures you that the building is simply settling, which it has been doing continuously for the last 10 years. Roman writers like Juvenal famously joked that living in these buildings meant sleeping with one eye open, because a collapse was not impossible. It was just inconveniently common. Your landlord appears once a month with the enthusiasm of a man collecting tribute from conquered provinces. He does not arrive quietly. He arrives loudly, announcing himself on the stairs, knocking on doors, and reminding everyone that rent is due. Rent in Rome is often collected frequently, and the landlord has developed an impressive ability to detect the faint sound of coins hiding in a tenant's pocket. Maintenance requests are handled with great creativity. If you mention that the wall has a crack large enough to store olives, the landlord nods thoughtfully and says that cracks allow the building to breathe. Buildings apparently are very concerned about ventilation. If you point out that rainwater is leaking through the ceiling, he explains that the roof is designed to encourage natural airflow. And if you politely mention that the staircase railing is missing entirely, he suggests that this encourages tenants to improve their balance. It is a very educational building. Roman landlords were infamous for squeezing as many tenants as possible into their insulae. Some apartments were divided into smaller rooms. Others were rented to entire families who somehow fit their lives into a space the size of a modern storage unit. From the landlord's perspective, every wall is an opportunity. Every corner is potential revenue, and every tenant is someone who should absolutely stop asking questions about structural stability. Roman satirists love to mock landlords. The poet Juvenal once joked that living in Rome meant constantly worrying about falling buildings, fires and objects thrown from upper windows. It was not exactly relaxing real estate, but the landlord always insists the building is perfectly safe. He gestures vaguely at the walls. He nods confidently at the beams. He says things like, "This building has stood here for years," which is technically true, just not always in the same shape, and if you ever threaten to move out, he reminds you that housing in Rome is very competitive. There are thousands of people arriving in the city looking for work. If you leave, someone else will happily take your room, possibly someone who asks fewer questions about why the floor slopes toward the door. So you pay the rent, you nod politely, and when the landlord leaves, you listen to his footsteps descending the stairs with the careful relief of someone who knows one important thing. If the building collapses, he definitely will not be inside it. Morning arrives in your neighbourhood with the subtlety of a marching band. Street vendors shout about fresh bread, olives, and something that might be sausage but might also be a historical mystery. The alley outside is already alive with carts rattling over stones, donkeys complaining loudly about their career choices, and the smell of bakeries firing up their ovens. Rome had thousands of small food stalls because most apartments didn't even have proper kitchens. So breakfast means stepping outside and hoping the vendor's porridge today is more grain than gravel. The scent of fresh bread drifts through the air, competing bravely against the less poetic aromas of open drains and yesterday's fish. It is time for breakfast. Bad idea. Because breakfast in a Roman neighbourhood is less of a peaceful meal and more of a sensory obstacle course. The first challenge is leaving the building. You open the door and step into a street already buzzing with activity. Bakers are unloading bread from ovens that have been roaring all night. Vendors are arranging baskets of figs, olives, and vegetables that look slightly confused about their future. A man with a cart full of fish is shouting about the freshness of his catch. You suspect the fish disagree. Most Roman apartments do not have full kitchens, especially in crowded insulae like yours. Cooking indoors would mean smoke, fire hazards, and the possibility of turning your entire building into a historical example, so most people buy food from street vendors. Rome is full of small food stalls called thermopolia, where hot food is served from large clay containers built into counters. You approach one of these stalls and examine the options. There is porridge, there is bread, there is something that might be beans, and there is a stew that appears to contain several ingredients still negotiating their identities. The vendor smiles confidently and hands you a bowl. The porridge is warm, slightly gritty, and tastes like someone whispered the word wheat into a pot of water. But it is filling, and in a busy city like Rome that is often good enough. Around you, the alley continues to wake up. A baker argues with a delivery boy about flour. A donkey refuses to move unless bribed with vegetables. Two merchants loudly debate the price of olives while gesturing dramatically with handfuls of olives. The smells are layered. Fresh bread, wood smoke, garlic, fish, and somewhere nearby, the unmistakable scent of a drain that has decided today is not its best day. You lean against a wall and eat your breakfast while watching the neighbourhood come alive. Children run past chasing each other. A woman hangs laundry from a line stretched between windows. A street dog sits patiently near the food stall, clearly hoping that gravity will deliver breakfast directly to him. Rome is chaotic, loud, crowded, and occasionally smells like a philosophical debate between bread and sewage. But it is also alive, and as you finish the last spoonful of porridge, you realise something comforting. At least today's breakfast did not try to bite you, which, in ancient street food terms, counts as a success. Now imagine trying to sleep in this neighbourhood. Rome never truly quiets down. Taverns stay open late, gamblers argue loudly over dice, and somewhere nearby someone is playing a flute with the determination of a man who has clearly never met your need for 8 hours of rest. Roman streets were crowded during the day, but at night they became even stranger. Labourers worked late. Deliveries happened after dark to avoid daytime congestion, and drunken philosophers occasionally wandered the streets explaining complicated ideas to people who just wanted a sandwich. Your sleep schedule slowly transforms into something resembling a confused owl. Let's talk about nighttime, or rather the lack of nighttime, because living in a busy Roman neighbourhood means silence is mostly a theoretical concept discussed by philosophers who clearly did not live above a tavern. As the sun sets, the city changes personality. Merchants pack up their stalls, workers finish their shifts, and the taverns begin filling with people who have decided the evening would be improved by fermented grapes and loud opinions. From your window you hear laughter, shouting, and the clatter of cups. Someone begins singing. The singing is ambitious. Meanwhile, carts roll through the streets delivering goods that were not allowed to travel during the day. Roman law restricted heavy cart traffic during daylight hours in the city, so nighttime becomes delivery time. This means that just as you're drifting towards sleep, an enormous wagon loaded with grain rumbles past your building like a thunderstorm made entirely of wheels. The walls vibrate. Your straw mattress trembles. A pigeon outside your window wakes up and expresses strong feelings about the situation. Then there are the gamblers. Dice games are extremely popular in Roman taverns, despite periodic laws trying to limit them. The result is a steady soundtrack of cheers, groans, and someone insisting that the dice were clearly cursed. Occasionally an argument breaks out. Occasionally someone falls over a table. Occasionally both happen simultaneously. You pull your blanket over your head and attempt to sleep, but then a flute begins playing somewhere down the street. The musician is enthusiastic. The musician is persistent. The musician may not actually know how the flute works, and so the night continues. Carts, voices, music, arguments. Somewhere a dog barks at a shadow that may or may not be philosophical. Eventually exhaustion wins. You fall asleep just as the noise begins to fade, which is exactly when the bakery ovens start up again for the morning shift. Sleep in Rome is less of a schedule and more of a negotiation with chaos. Eventually nature calls, which means visiting the local Roman latrine. Public toilets in Rome were long benches with holes cut into them, arranged side by side so that everyone could sit together like a very uncomfortable dinner party. Beneath the seats flowed a constant stream of water carrying things away through the city's sewer system. Instead of toilet paper, Romans used a sponge on a stick, which was rinsed between uses in a bucket of vinegar water. It's communal, efficient, and possibly the single greatest argument for modern plumbing ever invented. Now you might think that visiting the bathroom is a private moment. Ancient Rome disagrees, because the public latrine is one of the most social places in the neighbourhood. You walk inside and see a long stone bench running along the walls. Cut into the bench are evenly spaced holes, each positioned above a channel of flowing water. People sit side by side, chatting casually about politics, chariot races, and whether the olives this year are slightly disappointing. Privacy is not part of the design. In fact, if you sit quietly, someone will probably start a conversation. The Romans built impressive sewer systems, including the famous Cloaca Maxima, which carried waste away from the city. Water flowed beneath the latrine seats, helping move things along in a surprisingly advanced piece of engineering, but the experience still requires adjustment. For one thing, instead of toilet paper, there is a sponge attached to a stick called a tussorium. This sponge is shared. It is rinsed between uses in a bucket of water, sometimes with vinegar, which sounds reassuring until you think about it for more than 3 seconds. Still, Romans treated these spaces like social clubs. Businessmen discussed deals, neighbours exchanged gossip, someone might even bring snacks, which raises a number of complicated questions you prefer not to ask. The floor beneath your feet is wet. The air smells strongly of vinegar and stone, and somewhere a man is passionately explaining why his favourite chariot team is clearly superior. You try to finish quickly, but leaving too quickly can seem rude, which means you may end up nodding politely through a discussion about politics while carefully pretending this is all perfectly normal. Eventually you stand, wash your hands in a nearby basin, and step back into the street air. Fresh air. Glorious, beautiful fresh air. And for the first time today you truly appreciate one of the greatest luxuries of the modern world. A bathroom door that closes. Fires were one of the greatest dangers in Roman neighbourhoods like this. With wooden upper floors, crowded buildings, and cooking fires everywhere, a small flame could quickly turn an entire block into a very dramatic evening. Rome even had a night watch called the Vigils who acted as firefighters, though their equipment often consisted of buckets, pumps, and enthusiastic shouting. If a fire started nearby, the safest plan was usually running very quickly in the opposite direction, while carrying anything valuable, which in your case is probably a blanket and half a loaf of bread. Let's talk about fire. Because if you live in a Roman neighbourhood full of insulae, fire is not a distant possibility. Fire is a regular topic of conversation. Fire is the neighbour everyone worries about but no one can move away from. Look around your street. Most of the upper floors are made of wood. Inside the apartments, people cook over small charcoal braziers. Bakeries run enormous ovens. Oil lamps burn late into the night. Add all of this together, and what you have created is a neighbourhood that is essentially one enthusiastic spark away from becoming a historical lesson. And Rome knew this. After several devastating fires throughout the city's history, the Romans organised a group called the Vigils. These men acted as both night watchmen and firefighters. Think of them as a combination of security patrol, emergency services, and a group of very tired men carrying buckets. They patrol the streets at night, watching for smoke or suspicious flames. Their firefighting tools include water buckets, hand pumps, axes for tearing down walls, and occasionally large blankets soaked in water to smother flames. It is impressive for the time, but it is also very clear that if a fire becomes serious, the plan quickly transitions from fighting it to running. Now imagine the scene. It is late evening. You're sitting in your room enjoying the peaceful sound of the tavern argument outside. Suddenly someone in the street starts shouting, "Fire!" This word travels through a Roman neighbourhood faster than gossip about a senator's haircut. Doors burst open. People rush into the street. Someone grabs a bucket. Someone else grabs their cat. A baker runs past carrying 3 loaves of bread and a look of deep personal disappointment. Smoke begins to rise from a nearby building. The vigils arrive with their pumps and buckets, shouting instructions while trying to organise a line of residents passing water. Sometimes the system works. A small fire is extinguished before it spreads. Other times the fire climbs up wooden beams, leaps across roofs, and begins chewing through the neighbourhood like an enthusiastic goat. At that point the strategy becomes creative. Firefighters might tear down nearby structures to create a gap, hoping the flames will run out of buildings to eat. This is extremely effective if the building being torn down is not yours. Meanwhile, you stand in the street holding your blanket, your bread, and possibly a very confused pigeon that followed you outside. The fire roars, sparks drift into the night sky, and everyone waits nervously to see whether the flames will stop before reaching the insula you live in. Eventually the fire dies down. The vigils look exhausted. The neighbours return to their homes, and you climb back up the stairs thinking one very comforting thought. At least tonight the building only creaked. It did not explode. During the daytime the streets are packed with carts delivering grain, wine, marble, and occasionally something large and mysterious under a tarp. Julius Caesar once restricted wheeled traffic during daylight hours because Rome's streets were so clogged. But even with those rules, the noise of iron wheels grinding against stone echoes through the city. Living near a busy road means your entire building vibrates like a nervous tambourine every time a heavy wagon rolls past. Let's step outside. Because if you think modern traffic is chaotic, Roman street traffic would like to introduce itself with a donkey, 3 wagons, and a man yelling about olives. Rome is one of the largest cities in the ancient world. Hundreds of thousands of people live here. All of them need food, goods, building materials, and occasionally decorative statues of gods looking mildly disappointed. That means carts. So many carts. Wagons loaded with grain rumble in from the countryside. Barrels of wine roll toward taverns. Marble blocks for construction projects grind slowly through narrow streets. Each wagon is pulled by animals who clearly did not apply for this job voluntarily. Donkeys bray. Oxen move slowly with the patient resignation of creatures who understand they will be doing this forever. And the drivers shout instructions that sound suspiciously like arguments with gravity. The streets of Rome are not designed for this amount of traffic. Many of them are narrow, winding, and crowded with pedestrians. The result is a daily dance between carts, animals, and people trying not to become part of the road surface. Eventually, the problem becomes so severe that Julius Caesar introduces rules restricting cart traffic during the day, which means deliveries often happen at night. If you are wondering whether this solves the noise problem, the answer is absolutely not. Because nighttime wagon deliveries create a symphony of chaos. Imagine lying in bed when suddenly a cart rolls past your building. The iron-rimmed wheels scrape loudly against the stone pavement. The entire street echoes. Your building vibrates. A loose bowl falls off a shelf. Somewhere upstairs, a goat expresses deep concern. The cart driver shouts. The donkey stops moving. Another driver begins arguing about whose wagon has the right of way. Congratulations! You're now fully awake, and it is approximately 3 a.m. Roman streets also include stepping stones placed across some roads to help pedestrians cross during rain. These stones act like ancient crosswalks. They also act like obstacles for wagons, forcing drivers to carefully steer between them, which means carts sometimes slow down directly outside your window while the driver calculates how not to destroy his axle. During this time, the animals wait patiently. The drivers shout instructions, the pedestrians complain, and you lie in bed realizing something important. Traffic jams are not a modern invention. They have simply had 2,000 years of practice. Let's wander into the neighbourhood tavern, a place where locals gather to drink cheap wine, argue about politics, and loudly explain why their chariot racing team will definitely win the next race. Taverns were common in Rome's poorer districts and often doubled as inns, gambling dens, or places where sailors told stories that became more impressive with every cup of wine. It's lively, smoky, and filled with the smell of roasted meat, spilled wine, and the occasional questionable stew. Now it's time to visit the neighbourhood tavern. This is where the local population gathers after a long day of work, which in Rome usually involves carrying things, hammering things, or arguing about the price of olives. The tavern sits on the corner of your street, its wooden door always slightly open, spilling light and noise into the alley. Inside, the air is warm and smoky. Oil lamps flicker on the walls. Wooden tables are packed close together. Clay cups of wine sit beside plates of bread and cheese. Somewhere in the room, a man is telling a story that has already grown 3 times larger than when he started. Wine in Rome is usually diluted with water. Drinking it straight is considered slightly barbaric. That does not stop people from drinking quite a lot of it. At one table, a group of labourers debate the results of the latest chariot race. They speak with the intensity of philosophers discussing the meaning of existence. Their favourite team is clearly superior. The other teams are clearly run by fools. At another table, sailors from the port of Ostia describe their latest voyage across the Mediterranean. Every time the story is told, the waves become larger, the pirates become more dramatic, the sailors become more heroic. Nearby, 2 men roll dice across a wooden table. Gambling is technically restricted in many situations, but that has never stopped anyone in human history. The dice bounce, the players lean forward, someone cheers, someone groans like a man whose favourite goat has just been insulted. Behind the counter, the tavern keeper pours wine into clay cups while watching the room with the careful patience of someone who has seen every possible version of drunken behaviour. You order a cup. The wine is warm, slightly sour and surprisingly strong. But after a long day navigating collapsing staircases and philosophical goats, it tastes excellent. The tavern is loud, it is crowded, it is occasionally chaotic, but it is also one of the few places where the people of the neighbourhood relax together. For a moment the worries about rent, fires and leaning buildings fade into the background. There is laughter, there are stories, and there is the comforting realization that everyone here is equally confused about how the building across the street is still standing. Apartment living means dealing with neighbours, and Roman neighbours could be creative. Chickens, dogs and goats sometimes ended up in these cramped buildings, either as pets or future dinner plans. That means you might wake up to the sound of hooves clopping above your ceiling, followed by someone apologising loudly while trying to persuade the goat to stop eating the laundry. Let's talk about neighbours, because living in a Roman insula means sharing your building with a fascinating variety of personalities. Directly above you lives a man who owns a goat. Now in the countryside, goats are perfectly reasonable animals. In a 5-storey apartment building, however, goats introduce certain complications. For example, goats enjoy climbing. Your neighbour keeps the goat in his room, which means every morning you wake up to the sound of hooves clopping across wooden floorboards directly above your head. Clop, clop, clop. Occasionally there is a thump followed by the voice of your neighbour saying something encouraging like "Please stop eating the furniture." The walls of the insula are thin enough that you can hear entire conversations through them. This means you're now deeply familiar with the goat's daily routine. At sunrise, the goat complains about breakfast. Mid-morning, the goat attempts to eat laundry hanging from a nearby window. In the afternoon, the goat experiments with chewing on door frames. The neighbour apologises frequently. But he also insists the goat is very well behaved. Meanwhile, other residents of the building contribute their own unique sounds. Someone practices playing a flute. Someone else repairs sandals by hammering nails into leather with impressive enthusiasm. A family down the hall argues about vegetables in a tone that suggests vegetables are a deeply emotional topic. And then there are the chickens. Some tenants keep chickens for eggs, which means that at dawn your building produces a sound that can only be described as a confused barnyard attempting urban living. Living in an insula means privacy is optional. You know when your neighbours wake up, you know what they cook, you know that the man across the hallway snores like a philosophical thunderstorm. But there is also something strangely comforting about this chaos. In a crowded city like Rome, everyone lives close together. Everyone hears each other's lives unfolding through the walls, and sometimes, when the goat finally goes to sleep, the building becomes quiet enough that you almost forget you're sharing your ceiling with livestock. Markets spill into every available space in Rome's poorer districts. Merchants set up stalls selling vegetables, fish, oil lamps, sandals, and items that look suspiciously like they fell off a cart somewhere else. The problem is that sometimes the market appears directly outside your doorway, so leaving your apartment requires politely squeezing past baskets of onions, a crate of squawking chickens, and a vendor who insists you absolutely need a new clay bowl today. It's time to leave your building again. Which would be easy if the market had not decided to move directly outside your front door. Roman neighbourhoods are full of small street markets. Vendors set up stalls anywhere there is space, selling food, tools, clothing, and occasionally mysterious objects that no one remembers ordering. This morning your street has become a marketplace. The first thing you encounter is a basket of onions placed precisely where your foot wants to step. Next to the onions is a crate of chickens who greet you with loud opinions about the situation. A fish vendor stands nearby, proudly displaying today's catch. The fish look at you with the expression of creatures who would prefer a different career. You carefully navigate between stalls while vendors call out their offers: fresh olives, sweet figs, strong sandals that will definitely not fall apart in 3 days. A man selling clay bowls insists that you need at least 2 bowls immediately. You explain that you already own a bowl. He looks disappointed. Markets like this are the lifeblood of Roman neighbourhoods. Most residents shop daily for fresh food, so the streets become lively trading spaces filled with bargaining, laughter, and the occasional chicken escape. Children run between stalls. Dogs patrol the ground, hoping something edible will fall. Merchants debate prices with the passion of people negotiating international treaties. The air smells like bread, herbs, fish, spices, and dust. It is chaotic. It is noisy. It is wonderfully alive. Eventually you reach the end of the market and step into a slightly wider street. Behind you, the vendors continue shouting their offers. The chickens continue their complaints, and the clay bowl merchant is probably already explaining to someone else why they absolutely need 3 bowls today. You glance back at your building. Somehow your front door has disappeared behind a mountain of vegetables, which means returning home later may require one important skill: advanced onion navigation. Thankfully, Roman bathhouses offer a brief escape from neighbourhood chaos. For a small fee you can soak in warm water, scrape dirt from your skin with a curved tool called a strigil, and pretend for a moment that you're living the glamorous life of a senator, instead of someone whose ceiling leaks during rainstorms. So after a long morning navigating goat noises, onion markets, and philosophical porridge, you decide it's time for the greatest luxury available to the average Roman citizen: the bathhouse. Roman bathhouses are not just places to get clean. They are social centres, relaxation spaces, and occasionally the closest thing Rome has to a spa day. Which is impressive, considering you arrived here smelling like alley smoke and mild disappointment. You step inside the entrance hall, paying a small fee to the attendant. Bathhouses were surprisingly affordable in Rome. Even ordinary citizens could visit regularly, which is good news because after living in an insula with questionable ventilation, cleanliness becomes a deeply emotional goal. The first room you enter is the apoditerium, the changing room. Here, people remove their clothes and hand them to attendants, or place them in small wall niches. There's always a slight moment of anxiety when leaving your belongings behind. Not because Romans are untrustworthy, but because Romans are very enthusiastic about borrowing things. From there you move into the bathing sequence. First comes the tepidarium, a warm room that gently prepares your body for the hotter baths. The air here is calm and comfortable. Conversations drift quietly through the room. Merchants discuss business deals. Friends gossip about the latest chariot race. Someone complains about their neighbour's goat. Then comes the caldarium. This room is hot, very hot. Steam rises from the large pool of warm water. The walls glisten with moisture. The heat sinks into your muscles, relaxing every tense corner of your body. You slide into the pool and feel the glorious sensation of warmth soaking into skin that has spent the day walking through dusty streets. Nearby, bath attendants offer oil for your skin. Romans often covered themselves in olive oil, then used a curved metal scraper called a strigil to scrape away dirt and sweat. It sounds aggressive, but surprisingly it works. You scrape the dust of the street from your arms, watching the grime of daily life disappear in small, oily streaks. It is oddly satisfying. Finally you visit the frigidarium, the cold pool. Stepping into it feels like falling into a mountain spring. Your brain briefly forgets how breathing works. But after the initial shock, the cold water feels refreshing. You float for a moment, listening to the echo of voices against the stone walls. For a little while, the noise of the street disappears. No carts, no tavern arguments, no goats upstairs. Just warm water, calm conversation, and the soothing knowledge that at least one part of Roman life is surprisingly luxurious. Eventually you leave the bathhouse clean, relaxed, and smelling faintly of olive oil, which is the most glamorous you will feel all week. Of course, the moment you step back into the street, a passing cart kicks dust onto your sandals. But for a brief moment you lived like a Roman emperor, and that's worth the price of admission. Let's talk about trash. In wealthier homes, servants carried garbage away. In poorer neighbourhoods, disposal was less organised. Some waste ended up in drains, some in piles waiting for carts, and occasionally things were simply tossed into the street. Walking through the neighbourhood requires careful attention to where you step, and, more importantly, what might be falling from above. Now that you're clean and refreshed from the bathhouse, it's time to return to the neighbourhood. And unfortunately, the neighbourhood would like to talk about garbage. Because ancient Rome, for all its engineering brilliance, had a relationship with trash that could best be described as flexible. Wealthy homes had servants who removed waste and disposed of it outside the city. That system worked beautifully, if you were wealthy. In crowded insular districts, however, things were less organised. Household garbage often ended up in street piles waiting for collection. Sometimes carts came through to remove it. Sometimes the piles simply grew until someone complained loudly enough. Meanwhile, food scraps from vendors, broken pottery, animal bones, and various mysterious objects accumulated in corners of the street. Walking through the neighbourhood becomes a delicate exercise in awareness. Step carefully, look down, and occasionally look up, because one of the more unfortunate habits in crowded Roman housing involved tossing unwanted waste out the window. Roman law technically discouraged this. Reality sometimes disagreed. which means that walking too close to a building could result in an unexpected encounter with gravity's less glamorous side. You quickly learn to listen for warning signs, the sound of a window opening, a voice shouting something that may or may not mean incoming, a sudden splash nearby. The street itself becomes a constantly shifting landscape of activity. Street sweepers pass through occasionally, clearing debris toward drains. Dogs patrol the area with impressive enthusiasm for edible leftovers. Chickens from the market wander through like tiny feathered inspectors. Some areas smell pleasantly of bread and herbs. Other areas smell like a philosophical discussion between fish bones and hot weather. And yet somehow the city functions. Merchants keep selling. People keep walking. Children play games in the street, carefully avoiding the less appealing parts of the pavement. Rome is messy, but it is also busy, vibrant, and stubbornly alive. You just have to watch when you step, and occasionally where you stand. Let's talk about architecture, specifically the moment when architecture begins having second thoughts. Your insula has stood proudly on this street for several years, which is impressive considering it was built quickly, cheaply, and possibly during someone's lunch break. But lately something feels different. You notice it when you place a cup of water on the table. The cup slowly slides toward the edge. Not dramatically. Just enough to make you stare at it for a moment and wonder whether cups have recently developed personal ambition. You stand in the centre of your room and feel the floor tilt ever so slightly beneath your feet. This is not comforting. Roman insulae were famous for structural problems. Because landlords wanted to maximise rent, buildings were often constructed rapidly using lower quality materials on the upper floors. Brick and stone below, wood and hope above. Over time, this created buildings that occasionally developed interesting personalities. Doors stopped closing properly. Walls cracked. Staircases developed mysterious squeaks that sounded like philosophical warnings. You mention the issue to your neighbour. He nods slowly. Yes, he says. The floor has been leaning a little more this month. This is not the reassurance you are hoping for. Roman writers often joked about the dangers of city housing. Juvenal once described the constant fear of buildings collapsing or objects falling from windows. Living in Rome meant accepting a certain level of architectural suspense. You look out the window at the street below. Merchants shout about vegetables, children chase a dog. A cart rattles past carrying sacks of grain. Life continues normally, and yet your building appears to be reconsidering its relationship with gravity. You briefly consider moving to a different apartment. Then you remember the rent prices, and the goat upstairs, and the market that blocks the door. Perhaps the building will stabilise. Perhaps the landlord will repair it. Perhaps gravity will take a day off. For now, you lie down on your straw mattress and close your eyes. The floor creaks gently beneath you, but the building is still standing. And in Rome, that counts as a positive review. Travel down the Tiber River and you reach Ostia, Rome's bustling port city. It's full of sailors, merchants, warehouses, and neighbourhoods where the nightlife is louder and the taverns slightly rowdier. The streets smell of salt air, fish markets, and ships unloading cargo from across the Mediterranean. Today you travel to Ostia. Rome's port city sits near the mouth of the Tiber River, where ships from across the Mediterranean arrive carrying grain, wine, oil, and goods from distant lands. Compared to Rome, Ostia feels different immediately. The air smells of salt and seaweed. Gulls circle overhead shouting about fish, and the harbour is packed with ships unloading cargo from every corner of the empire. Warehouses line the docks, stacked with sacks of grain destined for the hungry city of Rome. Dock workers shout instructions as they carry crates and barrels along wooden ramps. Sailors from Greece, Egypt, and North Africa mingle in the streets, speaking different languages but sharing the universal ability to argue loudly about directions. The neighbourhoods near the harbour are lively and slightly rough. Taverns here stay open late, welcoming sailors eager to spend their wages after long voyages. Music spills into the street. Dice games roll across tables. Someone somewhere is telling a story about a sea monster that definitely existed. Food stalls sell grilled fish fresh from the harbour. The smell is wonderful, until you walk 2 streets over and discover the fish market at the end of a very hot day. Port cities have their own rhythm. Ships arrive, cargo unloads, money changes hands, and every evening the harbour district becomes a swirl of voices, music and lantern light reflecting on the water. You sit near the docks watching the sunset over the ships. For a moment the chaos feels peaceful. The sea breeze cools the air, the gulls glide overhead, and the empire stretches out across the horizon in every direction. Then a sailor nearby begins singing loudly about dolphins, and the moment ends. Across the sea in Alexandria, Egypt, the harbour districts were equally chaotic. Ships from Greece, Rome, and the Near East filled the docks, bringing sailors speaking dozens of languages. Markets overflowed with spices, grain, and arguments about whose cargo had priority. If Ostia feels busy, Alexandria feels enormous. This Egyptian port city is one of the largest and most important trade centres in the ancient world. Ships arrive from across the Mediterranean and beyond, carrying spices, textiles, grain, and exotic goods from distant lands. The harbour is dominated by the famous lighthouse of Alexandria, one of the wonders of the ancient world. Its towering flame guides ships safely into port at night. But once the ships arrive, the calm elegance of the lighthouse gives way to the energetic chaos of the harbour district. Dock workers haul cargo along wooden ramps. Merchants shout in Greek, Egyptian, Latin, and several other languages that sound equally confident. Camels kneel beside crates of spices that fill the air with cinnamon and pepper. The streets nearby are packed with markets. Stalls overflow with goods from across the empire, bright fabrics from the east, glassware from Syria, perfumes from Arabia, and enough grain to feed entire cities. The noise is constant. Haggling voices rise and fall like waves. Coins clink. Animals complain about their workloads. Somewhere a storyteller gathers a small crowd to hear tales of distant lands. Alexandria is not just a harbour, it is a crossroads of cultures. Greek scholars debate philosophy in shaded courtyards. Egyptian priests pass through the streets carrying sacred objects. Roman officials supervise the endless flow of trade, and in the harbour district life never slows down. You walk along the waterfront watching ships unload cargo under the blazing Egyptian sun. The smell of spices fills the air, the sound of waves slaps against the docks, and the city hums with energy that never truly sleeps. It is chaotic, it is crowded, and it is one of the busiest neighbourhoods the ancient world has ever seen. Which means if you thought your Roman insula was loud, Alexandria would like a word. Antioch, one of the Roman Empire's largest cities, had narrow streets that twisted through crowded districts filled with workshops, homes and constant activity. Walking through them meant weaving past blacksmiths hammering metal, merchants bargaining loudly, and children playing games in spaces barely wider than a donkey cart. Let's wander east for a moment, because if Rome feels crowded and Alexandria feels overwhelming, Antioch feels like a maze designed by someone who had strong opinions about confusion. Antioch sits near the eastern edge of the Roman Empire, a massive and prosperous city where trade routes from Asia, the Middle East, and the Mediterranean all meet. It is wealthy, vibrant, and extremely fond of narrow streets. You step into one of these streets and immediately realize something important. Two people can walk side by side here, 3 people require negotiations. 4 people require a small diplomatic summit. The alley twists between tall buildings that lean slightly inward, as if the architecture itself wants to overhear the conversations below. Above your head, wooden balconies stretch across the gap between buildings. Laundry hangs like colourful flags of domestic surrender. The ground beneath your sandals is uneven stone polished by centuries of traffic. And traffic here includes everything: merchants carrying baskets, donkeys hauling sacks of grain, children running through the alley like small professional sprinters. You step aside as a blacksmith's apprentice pushes past carrying a glowing piece of metal with tongs, the heat shimmering in the air. The blacksmith's shop is nearby, and the rhythmic clang of hammer on iron echoes down the street. Clang, clang, clang. It is the ancient equivalent of construction noise that begins early and never apologizes. Further down the alley, a perfume seller has opened his stall. The air is suddenly filled with the sweet scent of oils and spices. Jars of perfume gleam in the sunlight, promising luxury in a city where most people smell like work. Next door, a baker removes flat loaves of bread from an oven. The smell is magnificent. You buy one immediately because resisting fresh bread in any century is extremely difficult. Antioch is famous for its lively population and colourful personality. Ancient writers describe the city as energetic, sometimes chaotic, and always full of people eager to enjoy life. Which means the streets are rarely quiet. Musicians play in small squares. Actors perform comedic sketches. Street philosophers loudly debate the meaning of existence with anyone who accidentally makes eye contact. At one corner you pass a group of men arguing passionately about chariot races in Rome. None of them have ever been to Rome, but they have extremely strong opinions about it. As the day continues, the alley grows even busier. Merchants shout, customers bargain. A donkey refuses to move until someone produces an apple. And above it all, the buildings loom like watchful spectators to the endless parade of life below. Antioch may be confusing, but it is also alive with sound, smell, and movement. And by the time you find your way out of the alley, you realize something comforting. At least you did not get lost. Well, not very lost. Back in Rome, bakeries run almost constantly to feed the city's enormous population. That means ovens roaring through the night and workers kneading dough before dawn. The smell of fresh bread is wonderful, until you realize it's accompanied by the sound of grinding millstones at 4 a.m. Let's talk about bread. Because if there is one thing Rome absolutely cannot survive without, it is bread. The city's population is enormous, possibly close to 1 million people at its peak. That means feeding everyone is a daily logistical miracle involving grain shipments, milling, baking, and a large number of extremely tired bakers. You live near one of these bakeries, which means you enjoy the smell of fresh bread, constantly. Roman bakeries are busy places. Large ovens burn hot throughout the night so that bread is ready for the morning crowds. Workers arrive before sunrise to begin the long process of grinding grain and kneading dough. The grinding alone is an event. Millstones powered by animals turn slowly, crushing grain into flour with a low grinding rumble. Imagine a giant stone blender that never stops. Now imagine that blender living next door. At first the sound seems comforting. After the 3rd night in a row, it begins to feel like your dreams are being kneaded along with the dough. The bakery itself is impressive. Large clay ovens glow with heat. Workers dust their hands with flour while shaping loaves into neat rounds. Sweat glistens on their foreheads from the heat of the ovens. One man slides a wooden paddle into the oven and pulls out a row of golden loaves. The smell is incredible. Warm wheat, toasted crust, a hint of smoke. Bread is such an important food in Rome that the government sometimes distributes grain to citizens through public programs. Keeping the bakeries running is essential for keeping the city calm and well fed, because a city without bread becomes a city with very strong opinions. Customers begin arriving early. Labourers buy loaves before heading to work. Children appear with small coins to purchase breakfast. The bakery becomes a gathering point for the neighbourhood. People talk, they share gossip. Someone complains about the rising price of olives. You lean against the wall and eat a fresh loaf that is still warm from the oven. For a moment, the grinding millstones and roaring ovens feel less like noise and more like the heartbeat of the city. Rome runs on bread, and somewhere nearby, another baker is already lighting the fire for tomorrow morning.